Arguing about which game falls into what genre can often be a pointless exercise in trying to break the entire spectrum of humankind's artistic output into arbitrary chunks. On the other hand, it can also be pretty fun and thrilling to watch the birth of a new genre unfold. One big corner of the gaming space has been expanding on a particular sort of loop ever since the success of FromSoftware's Demon's Souls in 2009. The Soulslike. We've seen a slate of indie gems that blur the line between Soulslike and Metroidvanias like Hollow Knight and the Blasphemous series, as well as AAA franchise titles like Star Wars Jedi taking their cues from From. But despite core elements that identify a Souls-like, the flagship games FromSoftware has released have quietly taken bold risks with their formula, switching up the rules of combat and progression in subtle ways that make a huge difference to gameplay. We often talk about them in one frustrated breath, but even within the same franchise, From makes important changes that incentivize and highlight different sorts of player experience. So let's explore how FromSoft has revolutionized combat like 5 different times. To be clear, FromSoftware releases a ton of games and have an especially long pedigree in the mecha genre. Ever heard of Armored Core? Sure you have. The 6th one just dropped. And maybe you've even played Chrome Hounds or Metal Wolf Chaos. How about Murakumo Renegade Mech Pursuit? Or the Another Century's Episode trilogy? Oh, getting hazier? Let me hit you with Frame Gride. That's right, Frame Gride. I thought not. There are even easy FromSoft titles if you need somewhere truly welcoming to begin your journey. Monster Hunter Diary Poka Poka Irao Village DX is about bossing cute little cartoon cats around, and you hardly ever get attacked from around a corner by a sentient gargoyle. Yeah! But if you're ready to go all in on an exploration of the Souls-like genre, there's basically one man you have to thank: Hidetaka Miyazaki.
Game of the year? Elden Ring!
His vision for a new kind of hardcore hack and slash quickly came to define the FromSoftware brand in many gamers' eyes, and he's been a guiding force in the genre ever since, writing the majority of each game's story and text and overseeing every aspect of character, monster, and level design. So what defines a Souls-like? Here's the official definition from Miyazaki himself: those dark fantasy third-person action games with a higher focus on melee combat and sense of accomplishment. Made manifest, that loop often includes gothic horror, minimal dialogue,
a hunter should hunt beasts,
limited resources, tons of challenging combat, epic boss fights, big menus to mess around in when you need a break, and interconnected levels you battle through in the hopes of finally reaching the safety of a bonfire checkpoint, or a shortcut so you don't have to go as far next time around. Then there are the original elements that Miyazaki mixed into the formula to make something wholly distinct. A variety of unique multiplayer elements, stamina, poise, and posture systems, and in many cases, the ability to dodge around by doing somersaults in a full set of armor, which is fun. Perhaps the most defining feature of Souls-like games these days is some kind of limited healing system that you have to replenish, like flasks or drafts or flagons. But even that isn't true across the board, having been introduced with Dark Souls in 2011. In its predecessor, Demon's Souls, players healed in traditional RPG fashion by picking up items and storing them in an inventory for later use. In that game, the item in question was medicinal grass, which has since been decriminalized in Yharnam but remains illegal federally. This strict limitation on the life pool available to the player changes the feeling of the game in intense ways, introducing a unique tension between progress and loss, challenge and triumph. that many find makes for addictive and truly powerful gaming moments. For each setback and loss of life or XP, there's always some way, some slim hope that you might recover from the blow, whether it be by counter-slash or corpse run. Hidetaka Miyazaki has said many of these defining elements of the Souls-like genre actually had to be actively hidden from Sony during the development of Demon's Souls. Luckily for gamers everywhere, the team was able to maintain radio silence while still advancing the art form at a full sprint, like a bandit in black knife armor and a concealing veil. Don't worry, you'll get it later. Miyazaki has often credited the Kingsfield trilogy, the first 3 games FromSoftware released between 1994 and 1996, as the primary inspiration for the challenging dark fantasy world of Demon's Souls, which began life as a project stuck in development hell that he took over and immediately started bending to his will. That said, if you've played games like Wizardry or Steve Jackson's Sorcery, or even FromSoft's own previous title Otogi Myth of Demons, you'll definitely be able to feel that history deep in the bones of Demon's Souls. As the first entry of its kind, it obviously established many core aspects of the formula I've already touched on, like a focus on environmental storytelling that prizes vibe over plot, an anonymous protagonist hacking, slashing, blocking, and spell-slinging their way through levels as they pick up new weapons, magical items, and pieces of armor, and an otherworldly aesthetic that has developed over time into yet another signature element of From's releases. Notably absent are Estus flasks and bonfires, features that would soon define the formula and introduce a way to carefully control the level of challenge a player's facing, without resorting to permadeath or level scaling. Not that the game doesn't reward those with the patience to get good, Demon's Souls got the most important thing right from square one: the fighting. Sometimes slow, always chunky combat animations often make Demon's Souls combat, and Souls-like combat generally, an exercise in gambling your time. The risk and reward system in play boils down to questions like, will my swing of the blade hit that samurai skeleton's torso before their attack animation staggers me? And do I have enough stamina to attack this guy twice in quick succession and still dodge the guy coming up behind me? Killer sound design and oodles of atmosphere round out the experience, and a wide variety of weapons and magic that impart a wide variety of attack animations, coupled with standard RPG elements like the ability to find new spells and better armor, complicates the Rolodex of timings and rhythms the player needs to memorize and master, upping the challenge level as they progress. As baddies start to include more and more different attacks in their behavior palette, challenge can escalate right through hassle and ordeal to I threw my controller and broke my TV. But as many have noted, the feel of victory is equally sweet. To set yourself up for success, take advantage of the mechanics unique to this pilot episode of a storied series. For one thing, Demon's Souls centers on a hub location called the Nexus, allowing the player to tackle its 5 distinct worlds in any order, Mega Man style. This can make it slightly less frustrating for newbies than, say, Dark Souls 3, a notoriously tough entry with some branching paths, but ultimately many more points where you just have to beat the horrible thing or else there's no moving forward. Bosses in Demon's Souls are also much more puzzle-driven than in other FromSoft games. The horrible thing might be incredibly weak to a particular flavor of elemental damage, or have a spot on its body designed to be exploited via much chopping. That means if you get frustrated and look up, how do I kill King Allant, the answer will likely be more specific and useful than the cloud of different viewpoints out there on mastering FromSoft combat generally. Another valve on the difficulty level that has quietly evolved over the course of Miyazaki's career are those multiplayer components. In Demon's Souls, the most basic form, Players are able to summon allies with special items called blue eye stones and co-op bosses as need be, which can be a huge help when you're stuck. The souls enemies drop and the other kind of souls bosses drop are the currency of the realm, used to purchase items from vendors and level up your character's stats and abilities. The fact that you lose them, along with half of your health bar when you die, isn't unique to the From family of titles, but the fact that you return as a spirit and keep fighting from beyond the grave is firmly a Dark and Demon Souls mechanic. You can always regain your living form by defeating a boss or using an ephemeral eye. But remember that every time you die, the game gets subtly harder, which can really sneak up on you if you don't understand it's happening until too late. Often, it's wiser to remain in spirit form, even with the reduced life pool, until you've overcome a trouble spot and feel confident you can keep your flesh intact for a while. While both the original Demon's Souls and its faithful Blue Point remake are worth a playthrough, make sure to watch some gameplay of each before settling on one version or the other. And perhaps more importantly, don't feel the need to start your From journey with Demon's Souls. One of the benefits of Miyazaki's focus on diffuse nodes of story rather than linear cutscenes is that the games largely work as standalone experiences. Each game's combat style invites a specific mindset and kind of play, so you might be better off starting with the one whose mechanics make the most sense to you. Much like the original Evil Dead and Evil Dead 2, the Sam Raimi ones, not the Fede Alvarez ones, the Dark Souls trilogy largely refined the formula that Demon's Souls laid out and sought to capitalize on that success by not straying too far from home base. It's also important to note that the third installment came out after Bloodborne and takes a lot of fresh combat cues from the learning FromSoftware achieved working on that game. The original Dark Souls differs from Demon's Souls in a few key ways. Estus flasks replace healing grass and refill whenever the player unlocks or returns to a new spawn point. Unlike the hub and arches system of Demon's Souls, in Dark Souls these safe spots take the form of bonfires and are scattered throughout interlocked labyrinth-like levels with many branches. Across all three games, the anonymous protagonist is a class of undead called a Hollow, locked in a constant battle to maintain their sanity and stop turning into beef jerky. In the first of the three, being Hollow isn't so bad, primarily limiting your ability to engage with the game's multiplayer elements. Hollowing can be reversed by expending items at a bonfire, but doesn't actually weaken your character in combat. In contrast, Dark Souls 2 brought back more severe consequences for dying, causing the player to lose 5% off their max health bar each time they perish, up until they're rocking half health like the spirits in Demon's Souls. Bosses throughout the series are more fighty and less puzzly than in Demon's Souls, and the introduction of a poise stat allows the players to upgrade their ability to stand their ground and avoid being staggered while absorbing enemy strikes. This is a pretty major evolution of the Demon's Souls system, and something you'll see replicated in every Soulslike From releases going forward. Aside from being the second part of a three-part series, there are other reasons picking up with Dark Souls 2 isn't recommended. Series mastermind Hidetaka Miyazaki supervised the development process but had most of his attention focused on Bloodborne at the time. And it shows. Sort of like Super Mario Bros. 2, the penultimate Dark Souls sometimes catches flack for tasting off-brand. The physics and movement engine is different and feels like it, and combat challenges focus more on flooding an area with many enemies than dancing with a small number of enemies while you learn their movesets. The level design is a hybrid of the hub and wheel system from Demon's Souls and a more linear design that takes over in the second half. Many players and reviewers found this something of a letdown, but it should be noted that the level design on the Dark Souls 2 DLC content is considered some of the best in FromSoft history. Combine that with the introduction of dual wielding and an increased number of possible character builds, and it still might be worth your time if you can get over the weightiness of the actual combat. Dark Souls 3, once again developed under the watchful eye of Miyazaki, is sometimes called Bloodborne in a Dark Souls package, even though the combat differs pointedly. Both games feel light and speedy compared to Dark Souls 2 in a way a majority of FromSoft players seem to prefer, and share a leaning toward more aggressive enemy AI. Dark Souls 3 bosses are considered the toughest of the trilogy, so it might be worth getting some practice in elsewhere before tackling it. The return of a mana bar rather than Dungeons & Dragons style spell slots is a great quality of life improvement, and the more linear level design might appeal to players who feel lost or overwhelmed exploring the myriad corridors of Dark Souls, or utterly paralyzed by Elden Ring's open world. That said, that linearity also makes Dark Souls 3 kind of a repetitive replay. So if you're the type that likes to form a deep relationship with a game and run it through time and again, this one might not be your best starting point.
You found yourself a hunter.
With Bloodborne, FromSoft briefly ditched medieval fantasy for a dark and heightened world of arcane monsters wandering a plague-stricken city with a Victorian vibe. You play as a Jack Skellington-looking hunter in a tricorn hat, getting their ass kicked endlessly by werewolves and villagers with torches and pitchforks. In case you don't pick your games on vibe alone, I should also mention the key change that puts Bloodborne in a class of its own: your vampire-like ability to regain lost HP if you can counterattack quickly enough. Rather than the tightrope walk of gaining and losing souls, Bloodborne focuses on the need to balance your offensive strategies with the constant fluctuation of your health. You can't be shy about shedding blood, and the fact that you can quickly recover health by counterattacking encourages you to close in for brutal, quick-paced knife fights. Any kind of poise or posture system has been hidden this time around, meaning enemies can become staggered, but it's more a game of feel than pumping a particular stat or keeping one eye on a posture bar. Another bold twist on the From formula is the addition of firearms, as well as melee weapons that can transform between two modes of attack. Hot tip, you might think pistols would be great for hanging back and picking off baddies with some low-pressure sniping. And indeed, there are occasionally moments in the game when that's possible, but you'll have more luck if you think of your gun hand as analogous to your shield hand in Dark Souls. It's a tool for staggering enemies if fired at the perfect moment. Not to mention a way to aggro specific enemies and pull mobs. This adds a whole new dimension to navigating the map, introducing questions of positioning and highlighting the very important fact that you can progress in FromSoft games more quickly if you're willing to simply bypass clumps of enemies by running around them, saving your health and quicksilver bullets for when they're most needed. Bloodborne also places a premium on your ability to dodge and stay mobile, so don't be afraid to dive around like a lunatic until a boss's attack patterns start to become clear. After 4 medieval dark fantasy games in a row, it seems Hidetaka had an itch to explore other worlds. After the yucky UK of Bloodborne, we got Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice, FromSoft's most straightforward story yet, about the titular shinobi Sekiro, also called Wolf, and his quest to serve his master, the divine heir Kuro, immortal leader of the Harada clan. To do so, he has to decide whether or not to break with the man who adopted him and taught him to fight. And in many ways, Sekiro's combat system also breaks away from the rest of the From catalog and becomes something uniquely its own. I'm not just talking about his clockwork arm, which eventually comes complete with a flamethrower, shuriken launcher, firecrackers, and much more, but at least a dozen tiny tweaks that collectively almost reinvent the Souls-like wheel entirely. Instead of incentivizing close-quarters combat and an aggressive playstyle, Sekiro replaces 1,000 different weapons with one. Well, two technically, but Wolf carves his way through the game using a sword that works the same way the whole time. And thanks to a new posture system that allows him to insta-kill enemies that he's staggered enough, the emphasis is now heavily on defense. Perfectly parrying enemy attacks wears down a bar above their head until they break, making it easier to defend yourself to victory rather than attacking in many cases. Stealth kills, once almost an afterthought that allowed players to easily dispatch a handful of enemies placed just so in the world, is now a core combat element, aided by a grappling hook unlike anything in any other From game, and vertical level designs that impart a very specific feel to the flow of traversal. A smaller pool of special abilities and streamlined stat block almost eliminates the building out your character class aspect of play, replacing an anonymous avatar with a named, specific character who goes on an actual movie-like story journey. Another simplifying factor is that Sekiro only levels up his core stats like health and damage dealing by defeating bosses, shifting the game's focus from grinding for souls to posting up near particular stoppage points and fighting a single boss repeatedly, slowly mastering their timing and moveset, or learning how to exploit any key weaknesses through trial and error or by deciphering clues in the lore. All of these elements come together to create a combat loop full of deflections and interrupted attacks, rather than complete animations that you're locking into and trying to squeeze out in time. Even if you've mastered the rest of the FromSoft oeuvre, that alone makes it feel distinct and highly rewarding, and potentially the most uniquely shaped Miyazaki game so far. In many ways, fabulous ways that blew everyone's minds and rocketed it to the top of about 1,000 Game of the Year lists, Elden Ring marks a return to the core concepts that Demon's Souls pioneered and Dark Souls refined even further. The most glaring difference is the open-world layout, combining the twisting and maze-like interwoven level designs of Dark Souls with the freedom of choice hub games like Demon's Souls and Dark Souls 2 give players to tackle bosses and paths in any order they want. Your anonymous protagonist has a new horse to ride, and about 1 billion possible combinations of builds, weapons, and classes that make it almost infinitely replayable and exceedingly fun to experiment with. The plethora of options available and implied ability to go elsewhere and level up if you're particularly frustrated with a boss means many consider it the most accessible Souls-like in the FromSoft roster. Ironically, this arguably makes the largest, most complicated From game an excellent place for the newly initiated to start. Taking the massive world piece by modest piece will keep you from being overwhelmed, and the player's ability to summon help in the form of co-op partners or use a mimic tier to duplicate themselves almost serves as a de facto difficulty lever. You should also go in armed with the knowledge that builds focused on ranged spells and summons will generally be easier to progress with, while melee fighters will have a harder time but frankly come across way cooler and have a little more fun. I'd recommend reading a little bit about some of the more common builds people have had success with, and maybe even what the often confusing stats mean and affect. If you don't know your faith from your vigor, or what kind of character you're trying to build toward, progression decisions become much more agonizing. If I had it all to do over again, I'd honestly probably bookend my FromSoftware experience with playthroughs of Elden Ring. It's not only accessible while providing a great crash course in the modern state of the Souls-like loop, it imparts the skills you'll need to jump back to less forgiving entries like Demon's Souls or Dark Souls 3 and not go nuts. The reason I'd recommend a second playthrough at the end is to try another class and put the whole history of the genre in context. Plus, you'll get to see how far your skills have improved and get all of the fan service references and meta jokes. But please don't shy away from Bloodborne, Sekiro, or Demon's Souls. Each has its own rhythm and its own charm for those with the patience. Conquering your frustration and navigating the whole catalog is really the only way to glean a true appreciation of how massively Hidetaka and his team at From have impacted third-person combat. Not by finding a hit formula and replicating it ad nauseum, but by taking chances and even risking failure as boldly as, well, a FromSoft character. Sure, it would be easy to just make Dark Souls sequels forever, and probably profitable, but perhaps it's the difficult challenge of constantly reinventing combat mechanics that makes game design seemingly endlessly rewarding to Miyazaki. Like many players, I'm just grateful to see a craftsman of his caliber stay engaged and keep evolving the genre he helped define. For more on FromSoft, including tips, tricks, guides, articles, videos, editorials, and everything else, keep it locked to IGN.